Elian Mercer stepped out of his sleek black Maserati and adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his sharp blue eyes scanning the modest bakery in front of him. This wasn't the kind of place he usually found himself in, small, unassuming, tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. But after an exhausting morning of back-to-back meetings, he needed coffee. Strong, no-nonsense coffee. The scent of warm cinnamon and fresh bread hit him the moment he stepped inside, and for the first time in hours, his shoulders relaxed. Behind the counter, a woman moved with practiced ease, her hands dusted with flour, her apron smudged with chocolate. She was focused, entirely unaware of him, her dark curls slipping from the messy bun at the nape of her neck. He should have just ordered his coffee and left, but something about her made him pause. She finally glanced up, her deep brown eyes locking onto his with mild curiosity. "Be right with you," she said, her voice smooth but hurried, as if she was constantly racing the clock. He watched as she carefully placed a tray of golden croissants onto the display case before wiping her hands on a towel. "What can I get you?" Elian glanced around. The place was cozy, rustic, and smelled like everything good in the world, but it was also empty, no customers, no line. "Everything," he said. She blinked. "Excuse me," he gestured to the display filled with pastries, cakes, and bread. "I want to buy everything you have." Her mouth parted slightly, her expression shifting from confusion to suspicion. All of it." "Yes," he confirmed smoothly. "Every single item." Her brows furrowed. "Is this some kind of prank? Because I really don't have time for that." Elian's lips twitched. "Not a prank. I want to buy out your entire stock." She folded her arms, clearly unimpressed. "Why?" He hadn't expected interrogation. Most people would have just taken the money and handed over the goods, but not her. "I have my reasons," he said vaguely. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Then, to his utter surprise, she turned and grabbed a paper bag. "Fine," she said. "But if you're going to buy everything, you're at least telling me who you are first." "Elian Mercer," he said, watching her reaction. Recognition didn't flicker in her eyes, which was rare. Most people knew his name, whether from the business world or society pages. "I'm Quinn," she said, stuffing pastries into the bag. "And I still don't get why you're doing this." He leaned against the counter, studying her. "Maybe I wanted to see if you'd actually sell it all to me." She rolled her eyes. "Rich people and their weird power games." That made him chuckle. "You don't seem particularly impressed by money." "I'm impressed by people who don't throw it around just because they can." Interesting. Most people either fawned over him or resented him outright. But Quinn, she just seemed unfazed. She handed him the bag, her fingers brushing his for the briefest second. He noticed the flour smudged on her wrist, the tiny burn mark near her thumb, probably from an oven tray. She was real in a way that no one in his world ever was. "How much do I owe you?" he asked. She hesitated, as if part of her didn't want to take his money. Then she sighed and named the total. He pulled out his wallet and handed her twice the amount. She frowned. "That's too much. Call it a tip." "I don't need a tip. Consider it an investment," he said, her eyes narrowed. "In what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the bag and turned toward the door. But as he stepped outside, he realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, he actually wanted to stay. Elian didn't leave as he originally intended. Instead, he found himself lingering just outside the bakery, the bag of pastries in his hand forgotten. There was something about Quinn, some quiet defiance in her gaze, the way she hadn't been the least bit impressed by his name, that unsettled him. He was used to people reacting to him in predictable ways. They either sought his favor or resented his wealth, but Quinn had done neither. She had simply treated him as another customer, albeit a strange one. Through the glass storefront, he could see her moving around the bakery with practiced efficiency, wiping down the counter, rearranging trays. Her movements were swift, purposeful. But there was something else, a tension in her shoulders, an exhaustion in her posture that told him she was carrying more than just the weight of a busy morning. Before he could think better of it, he turned back and stepped inside again. Quinn glanced up, her brow lifting in exasperation. "Let me guess. You're here to buy the walls and the furniture next." Elian let out a low chuckle. Tempting, but no. She wiped her hands on a towel and leaned against the counter. "Then what do you want?" He studied her, noting the faint smudge of flour on her cheek. "You didn't seem particularly happy that I bought everything." Quinn crossed her arms, regarding him carefully. "Most people would be thrilled to sell out their entire stock in one go. But you weren't." She hesitated, then sighed. "Look, I appreciate the business, I do. But this bakery isn't some tourist trap or a hobby for me. I have regulars, people who come in expecting fresh bread, coffee, something warm before they start their day. You buying everything. That means I have nothing left for them." For the first time in a long while, Elian found himself at a loss for words. He had assumed his purchase would be a generous gesture, maybe even amusing. He hadn't considered that it might be an inconvenience. "Didn't think of that," he admitted after a pause. Quinn shook her head. "Of course you didn't." There was no malice in her voice, just quiet resignation. Elian exhaled, glancing around the bakery again. The place had a certain warmth to it, not just from the ovens, but from the way everything was arranged. It wasn't a place designed for profit. It was a place designed for comfort. "How long have you had this place?" he asked. Her expression shifted slightly, as if she wasn't sure why he cared. "A few years." "And before that?" Quinn hesitated, then shrugged. "Before that, I was figuring things out." Something in her tone told him she wasn't about to elaborate, and he didn't press. Instead, he reached into the bag of pastries he had bought from her, pulled out a croissant, and placed it on the counter. She frowned. "What are you doing?" "Returning some of my purchase," he said simply. "For your regulars." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or amused. "You know that's not how business works, right? I'm making an exception." For a long moment, Quinn just looked at him. Then, to his surprise, she let out a small laugh. It was quiet, barely more than a breath, but it was real. "All right, Mercer," she said, shaking her head. "You win this round." He hadn't realized they were playing a game. But as he met her gaze, something in his chest tightened. He wasn't sure what it was, only that he wasn't ready to walk away just yet. Elian found himself returning to Quinn's bakery the next morning, despite every logical reason not to. His days were usually dictated by a rigid schedule, meticulously planned down to the last minute. And yet, here he was, stepping through the door of a place that had no bearing on his world, at an hour when he should have been in a meeting, reviewing contracts, or closing another multi-million-dollar deal. Quinn looked up from behind the counter, her expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. She hadn't been expecting him, and he liked that. Too many people anticipated his every move, adjusted their behavior to accommodate him. But not Quinn. "Back to buy me out again?" she asked, dusting flour off her hands. "Tempting." "But no," Elian replied, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I thought I'd try something radical today, just ordering a single cup of coffee." She studied him for a beat before shaking her head, turning toward the espresso machine. "I don't know if you're messing with me or if you're actually serious." "A little of both," he admitted. The quiet hum of the coffee machine filled the space as Quinn worked. Elian took the opportunity to glance around. There were a few customers this time, seated at small wooden tables, enjoying their pastries and conversations. The place had a different energy than yesterday, livelier, warmer. He could see why people kept coming back. She set the cup in front of him, watching him expectantly. "You strike me as a guy who drinks espresso, no sugar, no milk." He lifted the cup, taking a sip. It was strong, bold, just like her. "You're not wrong." A ghost of a smile played on her lips before she leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "All right, Mercer." "What's your deal?" "My deal." "Yeah," she said, tilting her head. "Guys like you don't just wander into places like this. You don't buy out entire bakeries for fun, and you definitely don't come back the next day unless there's a reason." Elian considered her words. She wasn't wrong. He never did anything without purpose. He built his empire through calculated decisions, not whims. And yet, he had walked back into this place without a rational explanation. "Maybe I just like the coffee," he said. She gave him a look that told him she wasn't buying it. "You can get coffee anywhere." Elian leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Maybe I like the company too." Quinn blinked, caught off guard for the first time since he'd met her. He liked that look on her, unsteady, unsure of what to make of him. Before she could respond, the bell above the door jingled, and an older woman walked in. Quinn straightened immediately, her entire demeanor shifting from guarded curiosity to warmth. "Mrs. Holloway," she greeted, reaching for a fresh croissant. "Got your favorite ready." The woman mid-60s, dressed in a faded cardigan, smiled. "You're a lifesaver, dear." Elian watched as Quinn wrapped the pastry with care, handing it over with a familiarity that told him this was routine. "Put it on my tab," Mrs. Holloway asked. Quinn hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. "Of course." The woman thanked her and left, leaving Elian to raise an eyebrow. A tab. Quinn busied herself by wiping down the counter. "Some customers are on a pay-when-they-can system. So you just give away food." "Not giving away," she corrected, trusting. Elian studied her. If anyone ever tried to run a business like this in his world, they'd be bankrupt within a month. And yet Quinn didn't seem concerned. "That ever bite you?" he asked. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I'd rather take the risk than let someone go hungry." He didn't know what to say to that. It was the kind of logic that didn't make sense in his world, and yet it made perfect sense here, in this small bakery where people weren't just customers, they were part of something bigger. As she turned to grab another order, Elian made a quiet decision. He wasn't done with this place, or with her. Elian had never been one for impulse decisions. Every move he made was calculated, designed to yield the greatest return. And yet, in the span of a few days, he had rearranged his entire morning routine just to be here, standing at the counter of a small bakery, watching Quinn move through her world as if it was the only one that mattered. She hadn't expected him to return today. He could tell by the way she hesitated when she looked up, her fingers pausing over a tray of delicate pastries. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by something unreadable as she tucked a stray curl behind her ear and went back to work. "You again," she said lightly, not looking up this time. Elian leaned against the counter. "I figured I'd test a theory." She finally glanced at him, brow lifting. "What theory?" "That this place is the only one in the city worth having breakfast in." Quinn let out a quiet breath that wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." Elian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched her arrange the display, her movements quick, efficient. There was an energy to her that he found himself drawn to, an intensity that had nothing to do with ambition or power, but something deeper. "Is it working?" he asked. She glanced at him again. "Is what working? Me wearing you down?" For the first time, she didn't have an immediate response, and that silence, it was enough to tell him he wasn't imagining this pull between them. Before she could deflect, the door swung open and a man in a suit strode in. He was out of place here, too polished, too impatient. He barely glanced around before zeroing in on Quinn. "We need to talk," the man said, his tone clipped. Quinn stiffened, her entire posture shifting. Whatever this was, it wasn't a friendly visit. "Not now, Daniel," she said, her voice even, but Elian caught the strain beneath it. Daniel wasn't deterred. "You're out of time." Elian didn't move, but his entire body went on high alert. He had no idea who this man was, but he didn't like the way he was speaking to Quinn. She exhaled sharply, then turned to Elian as if remembering he was still there. "I'll be right back," she said, wiping her hands on a towel before stepping around the counter and leading Daniel toward the back. Elian wasn't the kind of man who eavesdropped. But he also wasn't the kind of man who ignored a problem when it was right in front of him. He stepped toward the door they had disappeared behind, just close enough to hear the hushed conversation. "You're 3 months behind, Quinn," Daniel was saying. His voice was lower now, but no less sharp. I've been patient, but that's over. Either you come up with the money, or we move forward with foreclosure." Elian didn't need to hear any more. He turned back toward the counter, his grip tightening around the edge. Quinn's bakery was in trouble, and he wasn't about to stand by and let it slip through her fingers. Elian didn't hesitate. The moment Quinn and Daniel disappeared into the back room, he pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to his financial team. Within minutes, he had the full details of her bakery's debts at his fingertips. The numbers weren't catastrophic, but they were enough to make it clear Quinn was on the edge of losing everything. He hadn't meant to get involved in her world, but standing here, knowing what she was up against, there was no choice to be made. He wasn't about to let this place, or her, slip through the cracks. The door to the back swung open, and Quinn walked out, her face carefully neutral. But Elian saw the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers curled slightly as if holding back frustration. Daniel brushed past him without a glance, exiting the bakery with an air of finality. Quinn exhaled, rolling her shoulders before returning to the counter. She didn't look at Elian as she wiped down a tray that didn't need cleaning. "Everything all right?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. She let out a dry breath. "That depends. Do you consider being reminded that you're one wrong step away from losing everything all right?" He leaned slightly against the counter, watching her, measuring his next words carefully. "You don't strike me as someone who gives up easily." Her eyes flicked to his, something unreadable flashing behind them. "I don't. Then what's stopping you from fixing this?" She set the tray down with a little too much force. "Oh, you know, the usual. Banks that only care about numbers, landlords who don't care about people, expenses that don't wait for business to pick up." She rubbed her temple, exhaling. "I've been trying to keep this place afloat for months. I thought I had more time." Elian had seen this before: businesses on the brink. Owners stretched to their limits, trying to fight a system that rarely made room for survival. The difference was, most of the time, he was the one making the ruthless decisions, the one forcing others to fold. But Quinn wasn't just another struggling business owner. And this wasn't just another failing venture. "Let me help," he said. She stilled. "What? You need money, I have money." He shrugged slightly, as if the solution was obvious. Quinn shook her head immediately. "No, absolutely not." "Why?" she scoffed. "Because that's not how this works. You don't just swoop in and write a check to fix a problem that isn't yours." "Why not?" She looked at him like he was speaking another language. "Because this is my fight, not yours." Elian considered her for a long moment. "And if you lose?" Her expression faltered just for a second, then she straightened. "I'll figure something out." Elian admired her resolve, but he also knew stubbornness alone wouldn't save her. He had built his empire on strategy, on knowing when to push and when to pivot. Right now, Quinn was too focused on fighting alone to see that she didn't have to. "Let me rephrase," he said. "I'm not offering you a handout, I'm offering you a partnership." Quinn hesitated. "A partnership? I invest, you keep control, we make sure this place doesn't go under." Her fingers tapped against the counter, her mind clearly working through the offer. "And what do you get out of it?" Elian smiled slightly. "A damn good cup of coffee. And maybe, just maybe, I get to see what happens when you don't have to fight alone." She searched his face, looking for an angle, a hidden agenda. When she didn't find one, she let out a slow breath. "You don't give up, do you?" she muttered. "Not when something's worth fighting for." For the first time, she didn't argue, she didn't agree either, but she didn't walk away. And in Elian's world, that was as good as a starting point. Quinn exhaled slowly, studying Elian as if trying to unravel the real reason behind his offer. A partnership. A way to save her bakery without losing her independence. It sounded too good to be true, and in her experience, things that seemed too good usually were. But Elian Mercer wasn't just some businessman looking for an investment. He was something else entirely, a force she hadn't expected to crash into her life. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her, offering a lifeline she didn't know if she could take. She crossed her arms, weighing her words carefully. "And what exactly does this partnership look like?" Elian tilted his head slightly, as if considering how much to reveal. I provide the financial backing you need to clear your debts and stabilize operations. You continue running things exactly as you have been, without interference. The only difference is you won't be doing it alone, Quinn narrowed her eyes, and in return you get. The satisfaction of knowing this place doesn't disappear, he said simply. She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. No one invests just for the sake of it, not someone like you. Elian leaned ever so slightly forward, his gaze never wavering. Maybe I'm not as predictable as you think. Quinn hesitated. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe there were no strings attached. But she had spent too long fighting to keep this bakery alive on her own to trust that help wouldn't come with a cost she couldn't afford. I don't need saving, she muttered. I'm not trying to save you, Elian countered. I'm giving you a way to win. That made her pause, winning. The idea of it felt foreign, like a luxury she hadn't allowed herself to imagine in years. She looked around her bakery, taking in the scuffed floors, the worn countertops, the little imperfections she had long stopped noticing. It wasn't a high-end establishment, but it was hers. It had been built with long nights, early mornings, and sheer determination. Letting someone else step in, even with good intentions, felt like handing over a piece of herself. Elian must have sensed her hesitation because his expression softened. You don't trust me yet, I get that, but this isn't about trust. It's about survival. Her fingers curled slightly against the counter. He was right, and she hated that he was right. Still, something inside her resisted. And if I say no, Elian sighed, running a hand through his hair as if trying to rein in frustration, then you keep fighting. You scrape by, month after month, until the numbers finally catch up with you. And when they do, when the doors close for good, you'll look back and realize you could have had another option. His words weren't cruel, but they were brutally honest. Quinn swallowed hard. Why do you care? Elian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black card. He set it on the counter between them, his fingers brushing against the surface before he pulled away. When you're ready, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Call me. And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving Quinn staring at the card as if it held the weight of an entire future she wasn't sure she wanted to step into. The card sat untouched on Quinn's nightstand for 2 days. She had picked it up more times than she cared to admit, running her thumb over the embossed lettering, memorizing the feel of it. She told herself she didn't need his help, that she could find another way. But deep down, she knew the truth. There was no other way. Which was why, on the 3rd day, she took a deep breath, dialed the number, and waited. Elian answered on the 2nd ring, his voice smooth and steady. Quinn. She ignored the way her stomach tightened at the sound of his voice. I'm in. There was a pause then. Good. I'll take care of everything. A part of her should have felt relieved. Instead, all she felt was the unnerving certainty that her life was about to change in a way she hadn't been prepared for. And it had everything to do with Elian Mercer. The changes came swiftly. Within days, the bakery's debts were cleared, the threat of foreclosure erased. Suppliers who had once hesitated to extend credit now welcomed her orders without question. The weight on her shoulders should have lifted completely, but in its place was something else, an awareness of the man who had made it all possible. Elian didn't interfere with her decisions, didn't demand control. He showed up often, though, always with an excuse, checking on his investment, needing coffee, wanting to see the place in action. But Quinn wasn't naive. He wasn't just here for the bakery, and she wasn't just pretending not to notice. One evening, after closing, she found him lingering near the counter, watching her as she wiped down the surfaces. You don't have to keep showing up, she said without looking at him. Elian leaned against the counter, his presence impossible to ignore. Maybe I like being here. She set down the cloth, finally meeting his gaze. The air between them was charged, heavy with something unspoken. You don't belong in a place like this, she murmured, his lips twitched slightly. And yet I keep coming back, She swallowed. Why? Elian's expression turned serious. Because for the first time in a long time, I found something that feels real. Her breath hitched. She had spent so long keeping people at arm's length, convincing herself she didn't need anyone. But here he was, breaking down walls she hadn't even realized she'd built. And she wasn't sure she wanted to stop him. Weeks passed, and what had begun as a business arrangement transformed into something else entirely. The late-night conversations, the quiet moments stolen between busy hours, the way he looked at her like she was something worth fighting for, it all added up to something undeniable. One night, after locking up, Quinn found herself standing outside with him, the night air cool against her skin. Elian studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You're not just a business to me, Quinn," she inhaled sharply. "I know," she admitted. He stepped closer, his voice low. "Then tell me I'm not wasting my time." Quinn's heart pounded. She had spent so long convincing herself she didn't need anyone, but standing here with him, she knew the truth. She didn't just want him here, she needed him. So she did the one thing she had been too afraid to do. She reached for him, and when his lips met hers, it wasn't rushed or uncertain, it was inevitable, a promise. One she was finally ready to keep. Months later, the bakery was thriving, no longer teetering on the edge of collapse. But more than that, Quinn had found something she hadn't even realized. She was missing a partner in every sense of the word. Elian stood beside her one evening as she closed up, watching her with that same unwavering intensity. "You still think I don't belong here?" he asked. Quinn smiled, lacing her fingers through his. "I think you belong exactly where you are." And as he leaned in, pressing a slow, lingering kiss against her lips, she knew this wasn't just a temporary arrangement. This was forever.